But then it quickly occurred to us, well, if we're going to all of this work, shouldn't we go to a whole lot more and actually rewrite it to have the API that we want?
Yeah, the most dangerous phrase ever in engineering, while we're at it.
Yes, while we're at it. Why don't we just redo everything?
I feel like we take you by the hand to the top of a cliff and then we push you down. It's like, how about we build you a staircase instead?
I just don't think people are going to build an app that's based on 0 point something.
And then there was this board in front of the framework teams, like a whiteboard, and it said bad ideas. And number one was unbundle the toolkit.
We didn't know how to force a random Android app to do the right thing, but with Compose, we can actually support this. So I think Live Edit works quite well.
It would be very tempting to do something that reinvents everything.
It was hugely controversial with the Eng team because it was the name of a piece of what we were shipping back then.
Is there anything we'd regret?
So many things. Oh, about Compose.
Yes. Hello and welcome to Android Developers Backstage. I'm Tor Norby from the Android Developer Tools and Libraries team.
I'm Romain Guy.
I'm Chad Haas.
And I'm Clara Vallarri, the current Eng lead for the Android toolkit.
Why do you insist on current?
Because before that, there was Roman, and before that, there was Chad.
And before that, there was also Roman.
Oh, yeah,
that is true. But today, I asked for everyone to come here because we're celebrating the 5 years of Compose going 1.0.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought it would be nice to chat about the people who were around when we started this, because it kind of started with Chet, then it went to Roman. And of course, Tor was around the whole time.
But Tor insisted on joining the podcast. We don't know why he's here.
Tools.
He wants to say WYSIWYG as many times as he can.
It was a concern early on, switching from data to code, which is typically hostile to tooling.
Yep, we'll get there.
Yeah.
We will get there.
Why don't we start at the beginning, which I think has a key word.
Yes, it does. So in the beginning, the whole genesis, at least from the toolkit side, was, it's really hard to ship an API where, like, when you fix a bug in the button class, people have to wait till their users get that platform upgrade to get that bug fixed. Wouldn't it be nice, given that we were depending more and more on the support library, to actually disengage it from the platform and ship in?
I just wanted to say that we always use button as the example, which is weird because it's probably the one widget where we had the fewest problems. Like
also the fewest lines of code. It's like 10 lines of code because it was a subclass of
it's text. It's like a text field, right? So it has all this capability in it.
Yeah.
But there's also the angle. I remember back then I was working on text and we couldn't fix bugs because people depended on the broken behavior. To me, that was even bigger than the API stuff. Like, we were just stuck.
We were stuck for the bugs. We were stuck for API. A lot of the APIs, like, gotten things to work in this kind of fragile way. List view is a really good example of that, which is why we had unbundled some things. Like we were already shipping recycler view in support library. And so we thought, what if we did that for the widgets? What if we took the entire API and unbundled it from the platform and shipped it with support library instead? So that was the genesis of the phrase that we were using at the time, the Great Widget Migration, which is why the real name for Compose is GWMI.
Everyone loved it.
Everyone in the team loved it.
Popular name ever.
I think it was only marketing that insisted on going with Compose.
I genuinely liked it.
I did too. I think we were the only ones.
I think so too.
So yes, Great Widget Migration was the beginning, and it kind of spiraled out of control.
Names are always hard, but I think we actually ended up with a really good name.
GWMI? Yeah.
Compose. I think Compose is a good name. Of all the...
Tor is being very corporate here.
No, I'm just saying that basically throughout my career, I've hated almost every single name that they've come up with. I'm not going to talk about previous companies, but like at Google, I hated Android Studio. I thought
We'll get to it. There was a vote on the name. There were very
I know. I was part of the
names.
vote. But I do feel like we ended up somewhere pretty good. Although most names, like now, I like Studio as a name. Like they grow on you. So we had a recent naming thing for a different project that, you may or may not have heard of at this point. And again, the Eng team hated the new name. But I was like, relax. I've seen this before. We're going to tolerate it and then we'll be used to it, right? But I think Compose, I think even when we picked it, I don't know that was like, oh, I hate it. Why are we doing it?
It was hugely controversial. We'll get to this. It was hugely controversial with the Eng team because it was the name of a piece of what we were shipping back then. But before we get to that, you talked about unbundling the toolkit. I always say, I remember like my first week on the team many years ago, coming to Mountain View, and then there was this board in front of the framework teams, like a whiteboard, and it said bad ideas, and number one was unbundle the toolkit. What had changed for you to decide that was a good idea?
I don't remember that being cast aside as a bad idea.
It was probably a bad idea back, in the early days when every bit count. Back when we said enums are bad. You can imagine the idea that every app would bundle all this stuff. If you can't afford enums, can you afford whole view toolkits? Probably not.
We didn't have R8 at the time. I mean, they were shrinkers, but nowhere near as efficient of what we have today. So, and yes, the applications were also a lot smaller. The amount of RAM, too, on the devices was a lot smaller.
I mean, even today, we spend an unbelievable amount of time trying to make Compose start faster because we don't have Vue's advantage of baked into the system, right? So every single app has to really try hard. So I can imagine that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that this was considered a really bad thing.
So
I remember at the time we're replacing this 10-year-old toolkit. We're coming up to 10 years. Because it's 5 from 1.0, but we started way earlier.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years before that.
I think 2017 is when
2017.
I've traced it back to when we started GWMI.
So you're saying it's time for recomposition? So when did it actually start? I was trying to think about that. So it must have been...
I've done this homework before. 2017, we started talking about unbundling, and that's kind of when we started talking about GWMI.
And that's at the same time that the other piece was getting worked on.
Right. So let's talk about the evolution of how it became Compose. So the first step that we wanted to accomplish was we just wanted out of the platform. So there's a different reality in which we would have the same exact APIs button with the ability to edit the text inside of it and all the silly things.
I remember
that
our key use case was, can we make button not inherit text
yes.
time?
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe we'd fix, some of the API problems, but essentially it was going to be the same API, except we could then fix the bugs in the APIs in the support library going forward. But then it quickly occurred to us, well, if we're going to all of this work, shouldn't we go to a whole lot more and actually rewrite it to have the API that we want?
Yeah, the most dangerous phrase ever in engineering, while we're at it.
Yes, while we're at it. Why don't we just redo everything?
And I remember we were doing architectural homework, and at the time, declarative frameworks were kind of emerging, right? It was a clear trend. React Native had just come out.
They were big on the web already. I think React was a big thing. It just was not in our, area.
Yeah, and I remember us doing the homework. There was some core group of us that would sort of go off every week and explore, something out there in the world and bring it back and say, okay, here's this model over here, and there are some instances of it in the world, and this is how these things work, and these are the APIs and the way that you work with it. And we went through this, and then we were in a holding pattern for a while with this.
I remember being, I was leading a smaller sister team of the UI Toolkit team at the time, and I know from the outside, it felt like a lot of explorations, but there was so much that it was hard to figure out which path to take.
Yep.
And it's a difficult decision to make, right? It's you have to make a decision that's going to last 4 years, and maybe you're right, maybe you're not.
More than 10.
Hopefully.
So do you remember what was the trigger for us to finally say, we have to make a decision?
So what I remember, we were seeing our engineers being a bit in that holding pattern, not knowing where to go next. So we basically went back to the team, effectively encouraged them to okay, pick that one path over there, start with that.
Yep.
That will unblock, and then we can start talking about concrete things. First give yourself a foundation, and then we can maybe throw it away afterwards. But let's pick a direction.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, but I mean, around the same time this started, there was this other project from Jim, who was very passionate about React. He had used that before. And so he was basically on his own initially, doing a bunch of research.
Right, so that was the small team I was leading. So Jim had joined, and he was working on this research project called R4A, so React for Android. And it was interesting, right? It was this Kotlin compiler plugin, and it brought the XML syntax that we had in our Vue's XML files inside your Kotlin code, and it could create a view hierarchy of, button, recycle view, and so on.
It was basically like the old JavaScript extension for XML, E4X, right? Where you basically could, in an XML file, put code around it, and it was a compiler plugin that was doing magic. And, I saw some slides. It's kind of amazing that it worked, because he had working prototypes for a bunch of things.
Yeah, it was great. And, as this idea took hold, our common lead at the time asked me to start. We hired a couple of other people, so Chuck and Leland. And so I started managing that small team. at the same time that, Clara and Chet, we were worrying about this widget migration. So it was interesting that those two things happened independently at the right time, at the right place.
Yes.
And then it was it conversations between you and I of like seeing the team and
because we were talking about like we were both doing
this
kind of like UI toolkit thing.
Yeah.
So of course we were talking about what did that mean for
right.
the two teams involved? Like what path should we take?
Yep.
But we still wouldn't merge for a while.
Right.
Yep. So I think the direction that we ended up taking in the beginning was looking at, I think there was a consensus that reactive was popular and useful, especially in the toolkit space. And it turns out that we had a toolkit API that was reactive at Google at the time. And we thought, Flutter is actually pretty interesting what they're doing over there. The specifics of what they're doing didn't work for us as well, being based on a different language and stuff. But what if there was a similar thing using Kotlin, and that was basically the genesis, right?
Yeah, and that's what I was saying, right? It was a great way to say, okay, let's start with that foundation.
Yep.
Whether or not that's the direction we want to take in the end, it's almost irrelevant. But it gives us a solid, concrete foundation, and then we can argue about the details.
I think we should give credit to JetBrains as well, because they didn't want XML to be clear.
So that's different. Like we're still talking about what's happening on the UI toolkit side, but we'll get back to the XML syntax on the R4A side.
I remember at the time talking a lot about how Flutter had existed for about 3 years at that point. I remember talking about the UXR of it and saying like, they've worked on these APIs. They've really kind of polished the experience of using these APIs. What if we could kickstart ourselves 3 years by learning from all of their experience?
And developers clearly love Flutter. I mean, it's an amazing piece of tech.
I think it was very important because then when we actually kickstarted Compose, UXR was like a core piece of all of it, I think. And what we know is Compose today wouldn't be Compose without the ridiculous amount of investment we did in UXR that came from that learning.
Yeah, no, that was great. And and also in a sense, credit where credit is due. It's easy for teams like us to come kind of after the fact, because to your point, React was popular on the web, Flutter was already a thing and it was pretty popular. So we had the chance of being able to take what they learned, and we were able to also, no framework is perfect. We could also look at it and say, like, pick and choose what we thought was great, what we thought could be improved. And whether or not, Compose is better, that's a different question.
It was just a good starting base. Like it got us out of that loop where we just didn't know where to look.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed, like in life in general, and certainly in a bunch of creative projects, is if you sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, now do the following thing, write a joke, write a book, draw a picture, whatever, at a blank piece of paper, you're going to sit there for a long time. What you really need is a constraint. To build around.
Or even if you start with something bad, like then you iterate.
Right. But at least you have ideas coming in that you can then, build on or cast aside or whatever. And that was what the Flutter genesis was for us. It's like, okay, let's start with this as an assumption of, okay, this is a working reactive toolkit. Where do we go from here?
So that takes us to that year we did like a toolkit planning summit. That quickly became the genesis of Compose. I don't think it was pre-planned. I think you were trying to do a planning summit, but it kind of became the Compose start.
I mean, it was a big investment and a big change for the future of the team and the project. So that makes sense.
I just remember having donuts brought in every day.
Of course,
why did that happen?
Because I think the manager was super into donuts.
Huh.
And so all the engineers were trying to impress the manager, and they brought in unique donuts from different.
I remember going out for walks in Boston to get donuts.
I just walked past that Dunkin' Donuts just last week. Yeah.
I miss donuts. It was the first time we really brought DevRel in. I remember that was weird, but exciting that suddenly we had this DevRel team who were interested in what we were talking about, and they all joined us, which I think then again paved the way of a lot of the first few years of Compose where DevRel were key to shaping Compose.
DevRel being developer relations.
Sorry, yes. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of all walked away from Boston with homework, right? We took Flutter and we sharded out areas and we said, you're going to look at testing and you're going to look at layouts.
So something we haven't mentioned, but I'm sure that was discussed at that meeting because I was not there in Boston, but 2017, that's when we had just, adopted Kotlin and made the announcement publicly. So when you started the Great Widget Migration, I don't think Kotlin was part of the equation in the original idea because it was literally taking the existing Java code and moving it out. So was that part of the discussions at that Boston summit to say, hey, if we're going to do something new, it should be Kotlin or?
We knew it was Kotlin, right?
Like there was no
Can't
discussion.
remember.
My recollection is that we
squirrely.
already knew it was going to be reactive at that point, because like that was my angle at the time. Was
We-
like, and basically the reactive part, we knew that had to do with the compiler plugin. Like we already knew that that what we had seen with R4A was that you got way more power if you could mess with the language.
Yes.
And that's what I was saying, that JetBrains basically were open to this. They didn't want the XML, but they were, at the time, you couldn't put compiler plugins into Kotlin, right? Like this was something they were building.
We were doing like
Partly-
private API, basically.
Yes, but they were interested in supporting this use case
So
and
more-
quite involved. And so we already knew that for a good reactive experience, we wanted this to be in Kotlin.
We definitely knew Kotlin because out of Boston, we did the homework. Everyone went away with, I'll look at this area and try and decide what is it that we like, what is it that needs to adapt for Android native. But then the next step, like a month later, was we ported it to Kotlin. So clearly we had decided on Kotlin by then. But I don't think I was part of that path. I think it was just
Or maybe it was
happening
just
in the
obvious
background.
enough, or people were excited
Yeah.
enough, or to your first point, because we had this example with R4 and the compiler plugin, that this felt like the path to take.
I still feel like that was we're in the weeds here, but I
Yeah.
still feel like that was later because I don't think that the R4A team was a part of the Boston conversation.
no,
I
no.
think we were just thinking about
Yeah,
APIs
they were still
and
separate at
Kotlin.
the
I disagree.
No, I-
Because again, I wouldn't have gone if it was purely an API talk. Like this was something that, our former manager was extreme, like this was his passion project, this reactive project, right? He was pushing it very hard. And again, we knew that combination was something we were going to look at. And so that was kind of my focus there, was like, how can this new thing, how can we continue having good tooling support for this if we are migrating towards a code model?
I have a feeling we knew about R4A by then. We knew we would eventually converge, but we weren't really talking.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, we had those discussions with Chet, but that was not like, we're not actively engaging on merging the two yet.
So another interesting dynamic, like given the timing of that, like that discussion where it's like, okay, well, now we have a future direction that we can figure out. We had not yet reached the point where it was going to be all code. There was an awkward thing for a couple of years at least before 1.0 where like we had some really interesting visual tools coming online that absolutely depended upon XML in the back end. And there were some tense conversations about people who are like, no, it should all be code. It should always be code. It should have always been code. And there were other people like, tools are really nice for doing visual things. So specifically constraint layout and motion layout were all built on the assumption that you do have a data file backing that stuff and they're not going to deal with code. We've seen awful examples where they try to deal with code and it just doesn't work. So that was certainly not decided at that point. Like I think most of the development going up to 1.0, that was kind of the elephant in the room of like, yeah, what do we do about tools?
Not 1.0, because 1.0 came like way later. It was true. If you rewind the Compose code base to the very beginning, you'll see the Flutter Kotlin port. And that's first there. There's no R4A. Then we merge with R4A and you will find the XML syntax, the KTS syntax that we called it at the time. You will see like the embedded XML tags inside of Compose hierarchies. And then we got rid of it because we started doing like dev previews. We went before alpha, we went like dev previews. And but that was like a whole year later. You can see the XML still in the dev previews and then it gets removed in like the first alphas.
And yeah, while we were all doing that, we were talking obviously with JetBrains a lot because we were adopting Kotlin. The tools team obviously had a great relationship with JetBrains. And the big question for us was, JetBrains could not stop us because it's a compiler plugin, but we wanted to make sure that we would do it in a way that made sense for the relationship. And JetBrains was not like, they didn't like it. My recollections, they were not actively against it, but it was more like, hey, if you do it this way, you're kind of on your own. And rightly so, I think they were worried about what it meant for the future of the language because you're kind of taking away some of the syntax from them. And if it's successful, then you're kind of hurting that ecosystem. And after a lot of conversation with JetBrains, we decided to drop that special syntax and go before to what we know. It was just what classes. The XML syntax was already relying on classes. Like a widget, you would extend, I forget what you would extend, you would override a function, and then it would magically
Which is kind of the
map.
structure that Flutter has, yeah.
Right.
At some point, I don't remember the order. At some point, we gave up on classes, and that was hugely
So what happened,
controversial.
we had classes. We gave up on the XML. We had classes, but the the compiler folks figured out a way to do it without classes and having just a single free function. But then the conversation became, well, if we have a free function, do we even need classes at all? Can we simplify? And that was one of the, I think, fascinating things about the road to 1.0, and that's just one aspect of it. We can talk about the rest. But a lot of it was trying to remove stuff, right, to simplify. And if we had rushed to ship Compose, it would be very different from what we have today, and I think more complex and more complicated. And yeah, every time I felt like, every win was like, oh, we can actually make this, it's not a custom syntax, it's not even custom class, it's just, you have functions, you understand functions. But we had the annotation. Or maybe the classes had the annotation already. You didn't subclass, but you used the annotation already. Yeah.
I remember the team being very against dropping the classes just because we were like, well, now you pollute everyone's namespace. Like suddenly everything is a top-level function.
But they don't have to be. They can be methods. So
I know, but I remember because we were all still pretty Java-centric people trying to learn Kotlin in the middle of this. It was such a against all your instincts move.
And the reliance on lambdas, which were also new to Java developers.
Yes. And around this time, I think, is also where you plug in, we work very closely with the UXR team, so the UX research team. We're taking almost everything we did and trying to run quick studies. And then we had the developer relations team who were running weekly hackathons on top of the latest.
That's true. But, speaking of that, actually, there was something interesting that happened when we did one of those, not quite a UXR, but when we were talking to developers, the advisory board, and we asked, hey, what if there was a new UI toolkit, or a new reactive UI toolkit written in Kotlin? Would you like that? I remember the answer was basically, nah, views, they have their issues, but we understand them. Don't waste time on that. And it's one of those moments where, I guess we went with our intuition.
I mean, we had the year before, they had said, we had asked vaguely, what if we introduce another language? And they were like, no thanks.
Yep.
And that was, of course, Kotlin we had in mind. They didn't know that.
Right.
And of course, the next year, this is the greatest thing you've ever done. So, sometimes you have to go with your instinct, even if you don't have...
But that's what's hard about those studies, right? I think the data is amazing, but sometimes you want to go against it. And it's hard to know when.
It's R&D, right? At some point.
Yeah.
You win some, you lose some. But I think, by really using it yourself, you get really good intuition. I feel like dog fooding our products, the developer experience is extremely important.
I think it was also a nice timing. I think we've talked about this before. The toolkit was in a pretty stable place. Of course, there were bugs to fix, but we kind of had the bandwidth to also go and do this research progress on the side.
The toolkit was in a good place, but I think the product ecosystem around us was at a stage where they were not requesting much from that toolkit, right? It's not like they were foldables that were coming up or XR. Got lucky on the time.
It was a peaceful lull because it's been busy.
There would be a danger in that situation, though, of us not getting the buy-in to spend the cycles on it. If nobody's asking for anything, and if everything basically works, then why are we investing so much money and time and effort into this thing that nobody's asking?
So the key, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's the same reason why we push for Kotlin adoption. A lot of us, whether it's developer relationships, UXR, and a lot of our engineers, we were spending a lot of time talking with developers, right? We have the bug tracker, but there's also Slack channels, the different social media. And I think we're really trying to tease out from everything we see on a day-to-day basis, what is the bigger picture? Because, if you just look at the bugs and the small complaints people have about recircular or whatever, you can spend an eternity fixing those. But then when you take a step back, for instance, I had a lot of conversations with Adam Powell back then. He and I had been fighting for years trying to convince a lot of developers to write custom layouts. And very often we would see people waste days or weeks trying to coerce the basic Android.view or Android.widget APIs to do something that, they were not really meant to do. And we kept saying, write a custom layout. But at some point, it took us years, you realize, well, if they don't, the problem is our APIs, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of... And gathering this kind of information and intuition, once you distill, the answer was, well, maybe we need to rethink things at a deeper level. And it was not we want to have fun rewriting, right? It was more we see the problems that people are facing. We know we cannot solve those issues easily with the current model. What can we do?
I think there was also some aspect of competition, or at least comparison to other alternatives in app development worlds, whether it was other platforms or just other APIs that could end up, targeting Android. Maybe they're trying to do a cross-platform thing where we were seeing feedback from the real world, and some of this was coming from the PMs, where it's like, you know what, our toolkit is not the greatest. It's not the easiest
No.
when you're comparing it to the other things the developers are thinking about, and maybe we need to get out ahead of that.
Yeah, and there were also, to your examples about talking about your example of button, there were areas where improving the performance of the existing toolkit was becoming very difficult because there were so many features that had to be supported. The architecture was never meant to be flexible and, let's say, agile. So that's how you end up, every button was an instance of a text view that brings in like massive capabilities, but you never need those capabilities for a button.
Yep.
So there's a lot of cost that we are paying like all over the place. And I think that shows in the name Compose. The idea was, okay, what if we made like smaller reusable things that are more targeted, less powerful in isolation?
That to me is why I think the name really works.
Yeah.
Because it is like, oh, you don't inherit, you compose.
It works on many levels.
Yeah.
What were the other? So I remember Crane was there for a long time.
That was the code name, right?
So you guys were doing R4A, and we needed a name that wasn't Gwimi. And so I remember brainstorming. Alan Viverette was part of it as well. We were trying to come up with names, and Alan came up with Crane because he was saying it's a migration, and he was like the idea of a crane like lifting something and porting, plus the bird is a migration bird, and so that's where Alan and I just started using Crane, and it caught in the team. And we even had a logo done by Virginia, who did for a while the studio animals. I still have my stickers. Crane was great, but that was the name while it was just us. Because then by the time our foray came in and we joined forces, then it was renamed to Kitty Hawk.
Oh yeah, it's true. I forgot about Kitty Hawk.
That must be after I had left.
And Kitty Hawk, I don't live in the US. It was a very obscure reference.
Here's a name that it should be called.
It's not that obscure, but yeah, it's you need to know your history.
Yeah, I didn't know it. For people who don't know it, it's the place where the first flight took off from, right? Which explains at the time we were building up Jetpack as well. Jetpack had not launched yet, but all that thinking was happening together.
Yes. Yeah,
everything at that time was being named around Jetpack. Everything.
But what is Jetpack, Jet?
It's just a name. Just a name.
Just a name.
So we've gotten to R4A comes in the picture.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, you're right. That's when Kitty Hawk was becoming a thing. And I think the merge or the transition of taking both projects and making them work together went pretty smoothly, considering. I mean, it was a massive amount of work, on the engineering side, but I think everybody saw the potential because, on the R4I side was beholden to views, and it was never designed to be view specific, so kind of didn't care what the components were. But it was clear also that, to your point, Chet, it's like, well, and this is this more ancient toolkit that has run its course, and there's this new thing that makes sense to target that.
I mean, as a manager, I try not to use the word synergy. But this is one of those examples where it actually
and
applies,
yet use that word a lot.
It is actually it's greater than the sum of the parts when you put those things together. Like it's a really, really great combination, I think.
It reminds me a lot of your book, Chet, about the early days of Android, right? There's a lot of the right thing at the right time with a bit of luck. It's what you were saying earlier, Clara, where the toolkit team, there was a bit of a lull. Things were quiet, so we were able to do those things. And a lot of things went right. Some were the right decisions, and some were just pure luck. We merged R4A and I guess Kitty Hawk, Crane, whatever you want to call it. And then it became this very interesting run to 1.0, which was a lot of, I guess, iteration on the APIs, the capabilities, and also a lot of work that I remember you were leading a lot, Clara, figuring out what is the MVP? Because the view system was almost 15 years old at this point, and there was no way we could recreate all the features. So how did we decide what we call 1.0? And I know that some folks might have disagreed with us, especially outside the company.
Disagreed with it.
I know, we disagreed as well, but.
And I remember doing all the homework, trying to define the MVP of every area, and text was always we need
it's a massive area.
Which explains why Compose still uses the framework tech stack.
Yeah.
We were like, if we really want to unbundle text, that's another 10
Well, it's that, but also the tech stack is a massive piece in terms of binary size.
Yes.
It's a very deep piece that goes all the way to the rendering pipeline, and that would make Compose harder to adopt.
There was also, was it the equivalent of a recycler view that didn't get 1.0? Wasn't that one of the things that didn't make the cut just because there was...
It was actually one of the pieces we had to have, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about how we decided what was a 1.0.
I think we were trying to pare down. I remember I took on like the material side of things.
Oh,
and
I remember that.
it was around the time material had just come up with what internally we called material 2, but I think externally never really got that name.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out what's the minimum of this that we can implement. And that's where I love the kind of the synergy with developer relations, because we were literally building in, like every week we would build a new thing and then we would sit down for a day and they would hack on the thing and they were like, this doesn't work, go back. And I think it was a lot of experimentation. It's when we started the Jet apps as well.
Right, but so what I remember is that you and others, I guess, looked at what would be the kind of apps we wanted people to be able to build, and from that inferring, okay, what is the set of material APIs? What is the set of, do we need a recycler view? Which every app is a recycler view somewhere. So.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the Jet apps, right? Like Jet News, Jetcaster, the original ones were those prototypes.
They were
we said, okay, let's focus. Yeah. They're like, let's try and get these off the ground. If Devrel are capable of building these, I forget if it was like 4 or 5 apps, we've hit a pretty good ground.
Yeah, and I think that's what, in the community I've seen when we shipped Android Compose 1.0 that we deemed production ready. There were some folks who disagreed, which is completely fine. But to us, it was, we knew that you will not be able to do everything. But based on what we had done, the idea was that you could build like representative apps, right? Like social network apps, these kind of apps, that there was enough there that you could do it in Compose.
And we took because we've moved a bit forward, we had seen Kotlin adoption at that point, and we had seen the success of, I can just rewrite this little piece of my app, but it works with all the Java I have. That was such a success that I think we focused a lot on enabling that, right? And we put a lot of effort into like the interop layer of, can we get you to just rewrite this one button or this one card to try and get people off the ground? And I think that was a really good call because it enabled that adoption.
I remember that as a beginning piece, probably around the Boston timeframe or a little bit after that, is like there has to be a tie-in. There has to be a way to still access the view part of things because there will be a migration.
And I think that even more so than in Kotlin, it was very powerful because, to your point, like you can adapt slowly by building, a debug drawer or a card or whatever, but also going the other way because we knew we couldn't build everything for 1.0. It's like, okay, whatever is missing.
An escape hatch.
Yeah, and to this day, you still use WebView because, rewriting WebView it's an endeavor.
We'll get there one day. But yes. But how about, we've been kind of walking towards kind of 1.0 tools.
Never heard of it. As we said earlier, for tools, typically you really want things to be data, right? So back in the old days with things like Swing, people would write handcrafted code and for loops and so on, and that just meant that you couldn't use the UI builder. And I think you mentioned something
just
similar
have to write
earlier.
an interpreter.
I think the Swing team at Sun really thought people would write their own layouts. You wouldn't reuse a super layout. You would I just need to lay out the buttons this way. It's a very simple class to override. Put them here. That didn't happen in practice.
You were
lazy.
It's the same thing Romain talked about.
That's what I'm saying. I'm repeating that point. And the way this happened was people would just use border layout, like north, south, east, west, terrible. And then people would go that doesn't look good. You need baseline alignments. You got these super layouts, right? The grid bag layout.
Yep.
Kind of like constraint layout.
Shutters. Yes. And then, they came out with something that was more toolable. I forgot what it's called. Was it group layout? Anyway,
group layout.
NetBeans had a really it was called Matisse, that was a code name, where you had this really nice experience where you can sort of drag and drop and it would suggest lines and just kind of snap to nice baseline alignment out of the box. But this was really now data, right? This wasn't code. And so I think we'd kind of moved in that direction that for a good UI builder, leave the UI alone. You can sort of set the layout up and bind to it from code. And that was the model Android had out of the box, right? With the whole set content view, and you had an ID on the XMLs, right? So this worked pretty well. We had very primitive layouts, although we did start building some more fancy ones. Relative layout was pretty fancy. It was relatively fancy. And then grid layout and so on. So that was the world we were in. And so this idea that we're going to switch back to code made us all very uncomfortable. On the other hand, it's undeniable that the developer experience is pretty good, right? So back in the Boston meeting, I remember brainstorming, how can we actually have something where you get a WYSIWYG experience, but we're smart. And so I still remember the algorithm. And the algorithm would be that we take sort of the XML file and we drop all the code. and you render that. And then you enrich it a bit, right? So if there's a for loop around a button, we don't know how many things it's going to iterate through, but we'll just do 3. So we'll show the button 3 times. And we can do all this thing where when you select it, all 3 of them get selected because they correspond to the same thing in the layout. And we can do that with the compiler, right? So we're starting to think, how can we have this hybrid thing where you get the layout, but we show you that it's somehow dynamic? So that was kind of the thinking. And then we're like, well, that sounds hard. Let's just do preview.
Well, where did preview come from?
Preview is very difficult. Well, preview came from the original layout editor. We had a WYSIWYG layout editor for XML with drag and drop and everything, right? So we'd built this very, very complicated technology called layout lib, right? Where we take the UI toolkit and we sort of pretend that, we'd rip out, snip, 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 all the bindings to various things and we sort of make it work. And we had that, and we had preview for XML even. As sort of a right-hand side panel that when you look at an XML file, you can kind of see the preview. And we started playing with metadata where you can put tools attributes into your XML. So this was a special thing we had done to the packaging tool, AAPT, where if it sees something in the tools namespace, drop it. So there's 0 cost at runtime. Like this is just meant to be design time enrichment. So we were kind of doing metadata for rendering there. So you could say, hey, because what was very common in XML was to use includes. So you'd have these little atoms that on their own were kind of uninteresting, right? This is a list item view, just a button and a label. And you're like, well, how do I preview this? It only makes sense in a list view. So we had a tools attribute to say, when you render this, put it inside this other interesting thing. And then we put like a translucent mask around it so you kind of see the layout, but this is the thing you're editing, right? So we were doing all these things. And I think that morphed into what became the preview annotation. This idea that you put some metadata about how to render this and you make it live with the code so that you get that best practice right up front. That you don't just have this UI that you don't know how it maps to data, but that you can actually see it and edit it.
Yeah, and then you have the powerful, because it remains code, it's nice because when you do refactorings, you never have your data get out of sync with the actual code.
Yeah, and it really, because what we saw was that those of us who used the layout tools typically made tools that could work sort of independently. There were people who never ran the tools. And you could tell when you pulled up their previews, they would like dip into the framework and it would throw exceptions. So you kind of want people to actually make sure the layout works with preview. It's, that you're keeping sort of church and state separate. That this thing is only rendering data. It's not reaching into your app object and pulling stuff from your database. That is bad architecturally. And I think Compose kind of, with the whole preview mechanism and just the way that you kind of set things up to be small independent pieces, you're already...
Well, also the nature of Compose, because the state doesn't live really in the widgets. It naturally...
But it could, through spaghetti. Someone could do it.
But I think the whole framework... guides you in the right direction where views, views should work that way too, but there's nothing telling you, hey, go that way.
Yeah.
Right. So it's easier to make the mistake. Whereas I think in Compose it's more obvious and therefore it becomes easier to write previews.
Yeah. So in retrospect, turns out to actually have been really good for tools.
So I think one of the dangers that like during this whole decision process of like, wait, if we don't have data, we don't have visual tools, is there is an ideal, I think, that many of us imagine where it's like, oh, you've got designers or developers with design aesthetics coming in and using visual tools to create this wonderful visual experience that is then part of the application. I know, other companies worked on variations of this over the years. Nobody has solved this problem. And I think specifically in Android Studio and Eclipse before that, we never saw like designers wanting to use this developer tool. And so we didn't really have that ecosystem of people that were going to be cut out of the equation.
No, I mean, there was a project that we were both involved in that was trying to do this. It was trying to bring like Figma and code generation and it went. I think we showed it publicly and it went on for multiple years, but I'm not sure what.
Well, also the reality of I remember because we did also UXR and user studies on things like the layout editor, and I think the majority of developers don't use those tools, but the people who do, they really like those tools. So it's kind of like a binary thing. And I think honestly, like those tools sometimes, it's purely personal. But when I use something like constraint layout, I'd rather have a powerful tool to help me. When I write a linear layout, like I'll do it in code, right? Well, so that's what was difficult for when it came to Compose, because depending on who you talk to, what data you looked at, like it was yeah, no, I don't need the tool at all, or no, I really want the tool.
And we had both of those kinds of people on the team. Some people were like, well, no, nobody should do anything but code. Clearly, this is the right decision. And you had other people who were like, no, I kind of like those animations, and motion layout makes it really easy. How are we going to?
Yeah, I think the key was starting thinking in terms of iteration speed for development, right? Because I think that's what previews are very good at. And later we had the animation editor even for Compose. It almost doesn't matter what the nature of the tool is. What matters is that this feedback loop is really short, because UI, it's a lot of like, you move things by 1 pixel or 2, you change your color slightly, and as long as it's fast to do so.
I mean, iteration speed that's a good thing too. We had this project, infamous now, called Live Edit. And this was back in 2017, actually, is when we launched Live Edit. And the attempt, we kind of wanted to make it so that you could interactively edit.
Wait, Live Edit or Instant Run?
Did I say Live Edit?
You said Live Edit, so
okay,
I think you meant Instant Run.
I meant Instant Run.
Yes.
Yeah, Live Edit was much later and much better.
That's Instant Run 2.0.
Instant Run was basically this attempt to sort of make it possible to patch your app, on the fly. And miraculously, it kind of works. We had it working. The problem was we were trying to make it work retroactively for all apps on a bunch of API levels. This was a constraint that was forced upon us, and we're like, this is really hard. And apps can do all kinds of crazy things. They can create a cache that we don't know about, and then you have stale data. So this was a nightmare. We resurfaced all of this with applied changes and later Live Edit because, again, if we only support Compose, we understand Compose. We know what to do to tickle your app to basically like repaint itself after some state of change.
Yeah, because at some point for Compose, we did it only when you modify the constants, right? So if you were tweaking things like the padding or color that was in code, like you would refresh like immediately.
Yeah, I mean, what we had to do back in Instant Run was like, well, you changed something in your app. How does the app know that? So what we would do is we'd restart the activity. As you know, not every app loves to restart the activity. Right? So they were just, we didn't know how to force a random Android app to do the right thing, but with Compose, we can actually support this. So I think Live Edit works quite well.
I think the other thing that I remember, I was thinking through the motion layout example, the other thing that worked well was we made the visuals and the interactions coming out of the Compose API much better out of the gate. So for example, some of the animation stuff and the transition stuff that's come online in the days since 1.0 means that your app is going to have a lot more built-in behavior that's just good UI. And so there's not as much dependence upon having to go to all that work to create that UI. So.
There was that, and I remember there was a big thing around not repeating the mistakes of theming and styling. Yeah. We had this saying in the team of, if it takes Alan and Chris Baines to go on stage to explain styles every single year at I.O., clearly we got it wrong.
Yeah, that's why I was mentioning about layouts as well, right? Because the layout APIs are a lot easier in Compose.
Yeah, maybe I saw a lot more of the styling stuff, like the material components. We explicitly decided...
was the worst.
We decided not to have a theming system. We're like, we can always add it later. Let's not make that mistake. And so it was a lot more transparent to find where everything came from. Like we suddenly got rid of the 20 layers of indirection of XML, which also helped with the iteration because you saw exactly where to go prod.
Right.
And we just have to say at this point, this year, we're doing styles. So,
Spoilers.
Yeah.
Which I think it was not just about the built-ins, right? It's what Clara was saying, but applied to every API where animations in Compose are easier. Therefore, you see more animation in apps. Even the canvas APIs and the drawing APIs are easier. So it's funny because I routinely see amazing things that developers do, on social media, and they show those really cool visual effects and so on. And knowing how they work, I'm like, yeah, all those APIs were in Android since Android 1.0. The one thing is that we made it too hard to use, and so that was out of reach, or it felt intimidating. But now that we made it easier, people are doing it, which was the whole point.
The scaffolding you had to build around it was huge as well, versus in Compose, you just open a canvas, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And animations, we tried, but the nature...
We tried, 5 times?
No, but it was the nature of and we can't just blame our tools, obviously, but, through XML, through Java, yes. Also, maybe the people behind the keyboard, It was always slightly harder than it should have been, and it made things unnecessarily complicated. And I also think that's where the reactive model is so powerful, because when you think about animations, You have those animators that have their own state. They're trying to keep it in sync with the views that has its own state, that may have a model that has a third version of the state, and the number of bugs.
And then you're going from one activity to another.
Yeah, and it's really hard to keep everything in sync, whereas in Compose, the problem is kind of gone. Like there's one truth, and that's it. So, and you animate it, and done.
I'm trying to remember where we were in the history side of this.
I mean, so the road to 1.0, like, I think it's interesting. If we can talk more.
Well, the road to 1.0 was like that. It was windy.
Yeah, but like a lot of iterations, and to your point, like, and that's why we started doing the dev previews so early, because we wanted.
We were nervous of calling it alpha, but we wanted to put it out there.
Well, the other interesting thing about the dev previews is because it was unbundled, you could have people try it out.
Yes,
in something that wasn't the platform.
Yes, but I think at the dev preview stage, you still had to build it yourself. We were in this weird, where like you had to put some effort. So we ended up with like a couple of people who were talking to us that were very interested.
Maybe in the very, very early previews, but...
Because then by the time we called it alpha, is I think when we went on stage and said, we're really doing this. No?
No, I think there was still dev previews.
Okay.
I believe so when we talked about it publicly. And yeah, we would release dev previews, every couple of weeks. I think it was also a matter of like, the APIs were changing so much that even for an alpha, we wanted to set the expectations of like, hey, we're figuring this out. Tell us what's right, what's not. We'll change it.
And to it's something we've kept to date. We release every 2 weeks. Is something we've kept from those early days because we're always in this.
Speaking of something that showed up during the development, I don't remember at what point, but modifiers.
Yes.
We did not have modifiers the whole time. I remember Adam did a lot of that work in design, but I remember like even before GUIMI and the early days of R4A, I was noodling with the idea of bringing entity component systems from the world of game and rendering engines to Android. And the idea is that a widget really is nothing. It's just it's a reference. And you just link those components, and components are the behavior. So I can render, I can layout. Never went past the idea stage, but I was talking with Adam a lot, and then he decided to take a stab at this, and he came up with the modifiers, and I think that was also a huge unlock, because suddenly a lot of things that would have been widget, like padding or things like that, became those like plugins that you put on your...
I remember at that time as well having a lot of conversations on how far do you take it, because we were building the material components and we're like, okay, surface, like is it a modifier, is it a component? And then you take it further, button, and we're like, well, we could rewrite the entire component set into modifiers, but then do you end up in like a very web-like environment where everything is a div that you then have to add, right? And I remember having tons of arguments on this, and I felt very strongly I wanted the components to be actual methods. Right. But Adam was pushing really strong back then.
Yeah, but it's kind of the best of both worlds, because a button, if you look at the source code as opposed to extending a text view, it's not doing anything magical. It's probably a surface that has a bunch of modifiers. It's almost an alias. And I think that's nice because...
It could have been a modifier.
Right. But what's nice that then developers, in Compose, when you want to modify the basic button, you're not starting from scratch. You can look at how it's built. You can reassemble the bits you want. It's not like good luck rewriting TextView.java on your own.
Yeah, and I think we landed on things that were concepts that we wanted you to know, that were like entities. We wanted composables versus modifiers were more like the decoration. But in that sense as well, I remember a big part of the beginning was this concept of let's build like an onion. Like button should just be 10 lines of code. And if it doesn't do what you need, drop down a layer. And we kept applying this, like if we can layer everything right, you could then just copy the 10 lines of the previous layer and do the thing that you want. I'm not sure we fully pulled it off in the
We
kind of
did not,
ideal.
but I think it went so much further than views, because there was always the issue with views. The metaphor I kept using is like, I feel like we take you by the hand to the top of a cliff and then we push you down. It's like, how about we build you a staircase instead? I mean, because that's what it is, right? I remember at the early days of Android, we had the list activity. It's like, okay, cool, it takes 2 lines of code to create an activity that contains a list. But now, what if you want a list that's slightly customized? Well, F you're on your own. and I think that was a big driver behind Compose. And again, it's not perfect, but having that ability to drill down and could be better in some areas.
And we're still improving. And maybe when you're talking about modifiers, it also made me think, like, in the last 5 years since we went 1.0, we've been doing a lot of rewrites of entire systems. Just we've been trying to make as little effect on the usage of our APIs. But like modifiers has been completely rewritten because we didn't anticipate the usage that it would get. We didn't realize that our trees would be mostly modifiers with a couple of actual layouts.
I remember Dylan showing me the profile traces, and we're like, oh, that's bad. We're spending so much time in modifiers. We need to optimize them.
Styles, which Tor alluded to, is currently in the works. We've talked about it publicly, but it's not like fully launched. And again, I feel like when it comes to components, we still kept a cliff that we regret. And so Styles is our answer to now being able to help with the customizability cliff. And we're constantly trying to redo little bits. Styles, I think, is the first time we're actually going to change API surface and ergonomics. And it makes me nervous and excited at the same time.
Is Chris Bain still around to explain how the new styles work?
I will ask him. I'm sure he'll be happy.
It just feels to me like changing things that way is now more palatable just because of AI.
Yes.
It's one of those things where, if you have a large code base, you can migrate.
But we've skipped like 5 years ahead, yes.
But so that road to 1.0 for Compose was interesting. In some ways, we simplified things. For instance, when we ended up with just functions, it's kind of nice because when you create your tree of composables, the syntax is always the same. It's like they're all function calls embedded into another. And then we complexified a little bit with the concept of modifier, which was slightly different. But I think it also simplified the UI, because to your point, like, in HTML, like every one of those things, because they have the style sheet, so it's not exactly correct. But if padding, for instance, was its own widget, like we did at the beginning, actually, then certainly you get like those much, much deeper.
It was really hard to maintain. Like we had these like files that kept going.
Yeah. And modifiers are kind of a way out. But at the same time, something that's cool about modifiers that I don't see used too often, but you can pre-create a chain of modifiers almost as a style and just pass it around and say, use that chain like a background in the padding, for instance. And
is there anything we'd regret?
So many things. Oh, about Compose.
Yes.
I have some. I think for a couple things. One is around the drawing APIs. That was not the focus because the widgets are more interesting. But I think we did not bring all the APIs that from Canvas and Paint to Compose. So to this day, sometimes you have to drop down to those objects, which is fine. But now that some folks are like into Compose multi-platform, it's a bit annoying because you have code that's specific to Android. And I think we could have gone a little further with those drawing APIs. The other one, we were worried about performance quite a bit, but I would say not enough. And I think we underestimated how much performance we would need, because when we started working on Compose, like more modern hardware, we had art, so a much better garbage collector. I think we are not as careful as we should have been on some aspects. And some of it, after
APIs led to things you couldn't.
Yeah, and so after the fact, you look at some of those APIs, like because of the API, we have to pay for that allocation on every layout, for instance, because the API calls for that.
And at the beginning, a big mantra we were trying to keep was, as long as we can pull it off, make it easy for the usage, right? Like we were prioritizing the ergonomics of using Compose over any of these trade-offs. And maybe we overestimated kind of like the runtime will fix it for a while. But I think you could regret that, but I think it took us to very interesting places that if we had been fixated on performance from the beginning, we would have made very different trade-offs.
I agree, but I think we could have had, because there are places where, because we did fix a lot of performance under the hood post 1.0 and we kept the API. So I think it is possible to keep the ergonomics and be more careful. I think it's the internal implementation where, it was this new world of like, hey, we don't have to write Java code the C way anymore, but we went a bit too far that way. But again, we rewrote we
fixed a lot of it. We deprecated a lot of APIs when we found like the performance.
The modifiers with the lambdas.
And for example, for styles, we're talking about like, I'm very excited about like the ergonomics side of styles, but also styles is going to come with huge performance boost because it allows us to plumb things differently internally.
How often does that happen? Do you get something that is both more productive and more performant?
Well,
that is a really
really nice engineers on the team.
Yes,
and that's the thing. Compose, even by nature, because you have those smaller widgets, they can use a lot less memory. They can be much more efficient because they don't have to look at a million features that you're never going to use. But again, I think for the early days of 1.0, we're talking about regrets. I think it would have helped onboard a few more developers if we had been a bit more careful. But it's a trade-off. Like, we spent more time on the APIs, and I think that was, if we have to choose,
are very nice. And I think that we got the kind of growth that maybe would have, if we just recreated a super performant Views 2.0, it would be Views 2.0.
Yeah, of course. And then we would have regretted the API. So it's a trade-off. And R8 definitely helps. So turn on R8.
What about the time? So it was clearly the right call to base it on Kotlin. What did that mean in terms of adoption by developers that were not yet on board? Right?
If you're
leading
not
edge
adopt
developers,
Kotlin,
obviously.
you're not going to adopt Compose. I mean, Kotlin is a very easy thing to adopt because you can do a single file in the middle of your code base, and there's a button for it.
Right.
So where it is much harder, as we've discovered, to switch from a little bit of Views to a little bit of Compose, because it is rethinking everything.
But I feel it goes hand in hand, and they are an incentive for each other, right? If you are not adopting Kotlin, but then you see this new UI toolkit, where you have to use Kotlin,
I just
and the other
wonder,
way around.
How many existing developers and apps were looking at it going, wow, that first step is a doozy. I have work to do.
We had that for a long time, but maybe it's because I think we spaced out the two curves kind of nicely in a way that Kotlin was gaining traction, and Compose wasn't really ready for everyone to write all of their UI in Compose either. And so it was over time, as we've been ready, the ecosystem has been ready with us, right?
Yeah, I just don't think it's because I feel like Kotlin adoption happened very rapidly. Because again, it was so easy to do, and it's like so undeniably better. There's like only one downside, static, but yeah. Whereas I think Compose is a much more difficult thing. So I think if someone is like, I don't want to touch Kotlin, they're not going to be interested in Compose. I don't think.
And it goes back to we argued over whether we called it 1.0 or not a lot because the Eng team was very against it. We're like, we're not done. We really want to work. We really want to fix all these things. But I understand now the trade-off that was made. But really, it's taken us 5 years. It's at I/O this year that we said, we'll actually write all your UI in Compose. We now feel ready. And it took us 5 years. And I think it's all of this played.
I don't think it has to be a complete replacement for it to be a 1.0.
Yeah, and I think it was easier for some of us, who had been on Android in the early days, where when we did Android 1.0, in the last few months of Android 1.0, we were just cutting features constantly because we had to ship something, right? And then you spend several years going where you want to be. And that was a great experience to learn what it takes to ship. It's a trade-off. You can keep working on something forever, but you have to ship it at some point. It's never going to be perfect.
And I now see if we hadn't shipped, we would have missed a boat, right? Completely. Yes.
Yeah. And Android Studio 1.0 did not have all the features of Eclipse. But we felt that it was this is now good enough for anyone to switch to, and it's better.
I also think it needs to be a representative of your vision, right?
Yeah.
To show and convince people, this is where we're going, and if you like what you see, even if it's not quite ready for you just yet, at least you can come along and give us feedback.
I just don't think people are going to build an app that's based on 0 point something. You know what I mean? Here's my production app.
Some people did.
Some people would. I mean, we saw
people were shipping apps with it
within weeks, right? But I'm saying if we want to say you can now start shipping this in production, it has to be 1.0.
And actually, another thing that happened to Compose that I think was, I don't know if it was excellent timing or we were amazing salespeople, but the Play Store was considering a big re-architecture. They were embarking on this big re-architecture of the app because the Play Store was, again, 15 years old at that point or whatever. And we saw that maybe it would be a good opportunity for us to have our first Compose app, which we know, in retrospect, starting with the Play Store was
that is
courageous on both sides.
Trial by fire.
That's the most installed app in the world, right? It's on basically every device.
And I would be forever grateful to the Play Store team and it was hard for them. It was really hard. So
it was, but I think we matched, they were passionate about what we were doing and they kind of matched the excitement we had on our side because they adopted us way before 1.0.
Yeah. And that's my point. It was I'm again so grateful to them because it was painful.
It still is. I think they're still one of our biggest testers, right? And they're still the first ones to scream at us when there's a performance regression, or they're still an incredible
rightly
partner.
So.
Mm-hmm.
So back to your question, though, Tor, I think I only have one lasting regret, which is as nice as the name Compose is, it
should have fought for Gwimi.
I did fight for it.
We'll put that on your tombstone.
We can go back to naming because obviously Gwimi insisted it being on the list. No one voted for it. But we had this spreadsheet of names that was running around in the weeks before. We were trying to freeze Jetpack because Jetpack launched at it was a month or two before. And we had Compose and Compose at that time was the internal name for our foray. So we were so against like stealing the name, because we ended up in a place where we didn't actually give the runtime compiler a name because we stole the name for the entire project.
Yeah, I mean, and that was I mean, and I know there's been arguments in the community about it, and that one's difficult because on one hand, calling the whole thing Compose is a bit of a disservice to the underlying runtime that can work for anything. It doesn't have to be UI. Anything that's more or less tree-shaped, you can use the runtime for it. At the same time, I think, the size of the population that would care about this level of details is small enough that creating that confusion of having random code names or random product names, like, I don't know, yeah.
I was always in favor of not giving the compiler runtime a name, because I also said as a team we weren't ready to support other
I mean, we just called it the Compose runtime and compiler. Like,
Yeah.
That's a name.
But there were other names. We were Team Crane, and we were trying to get Crane to be the name. There were a lot of like musical names proposed.
Sonata.
Yeah, Sonata was one of. Symphony, I think, was another one. I can't remember many of the others, but there was a lot of play on
looked
music.
out.
They would have all been good names.
You would have gotten used to them, Tor. Like,
Okay.
that's the point you made earlier.
Yeah, I would have.
What's in the name doesn't matter.
Just-
Technically the name is Jetpack Compose, but people usually say Compose. So,
Yes.
so you should keep the name short.
But to be honest, Jetpack Compose is easier to Google. than if
Yes,
we had
absolutely.
called it just Compose.
Yes. And even today, sometimes when I look up an API, I have to first put androidx.compose to make sure like it takes me to the actual Compose APIs. Yeah, it's a tough one. But yeah, Kai, did you have any regrets on?
Maybe I'm too in the weeds of it. To me, it's not regrets, it's just learnings, right? Like I love that we have a team who loves so much what they do that we're just constantly iterating, right? And I see someone recently told me, like, you've all got to remember how good Compose is, because we're always so focused on the bad. We're always like, and this is not working, and that is wrong, and that API should change. But to me, they're not regrets, because you can't get everything perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm amazed at what we produced as a 1.0, and then at the gymnastics we've done to evolve each piece that we've had. Like, each big regret has now been rewritten. We completely rewrote semantics. We completely rewrote layouts. Modifiers was a huge one. So I think we've tackled, but they're not regrets, because I don't think perfect was possible.
There can be regrets
right?
without, if you had to go back, like, doesn't mean you wouldn't change a thing, because it worked out. So
Well, maybe we can wrap up with, what, like, favorite highlight of, the life of Compose.
My favorite was probably, while working early days on Material, coming up with slot APIs. Because it was such a revelation when we realized we could do what we call now slot APIs, when you just take a lambda and you can fill in something of a component. And suddenly it solved the button problem. And because button was our favorite example.
The Sunday's discussions. Yeah,
suddenly
another
it
example.
solved button, right?
We got so lucky with Kotlin because, yeah.
But to me, that's my favorite piece of Compose.
Well, I would say Gueme, except it lost. So I would say the thing that you were just talking about like rewriting so many substantial parts, I think is a call out to the fact that we did unbundle it and we could do that. Right, like do you change APIs between major versions?
We haven't done a major version. We're still one.
Okay, so you're still one, but you could. And in the meantime, you can change the way things work without like breaking people in the community, because you know what, that app is going to ship with this functionality. They're not going to depend on stuff that's in the platform that is going to be different between releases. And I think like the core premise of doing Compose to begin with enabled this in a way that we could no longer do in the platform. We kind of had what we had, and we really couldn't change it that much.
And I think I will cheat and say two things. The first one is it's mostly because it's pure and elegant, but the fact that we landed on functions as being a widget, I think it really helped our messaging. We were trying to explain the concept of the state has to be hoisted, and when you say it's a function, like it shows up in the parameters, and you really have to get out of your way to not do that because of functions. And I think it was a big change, but I think it was a great one. And internally, it was one of those changes where we felt like it was right, but we were uncomfortable about it, which is usually a good sign. And the second one, I love how the team was both ambitious, but also extremely pragmatic. It's like it's a brand new framework. It would be very tempting to do something that reinvents everything. but we made sure we wanted the compatibility with views both ways. There was a lot of thinking around how do we help developers move to Compose? How do we accompany them, making sure that they can be relevant? How do we make sure those companies? And we did the same for Kotlin, and I think that was I love seeing that. Right, it was not just us having fun. We were trying to solve real world problems that we were seeing every day. Whether or not we succeeded, that's not for me to answer. But yeah, we did our best, and I think I like the result.
There's many things, but I think the one maybe I'll call out is about a year ago. Deciding we're going to do on the tool side, do everything in Compose. So, I'm responsible for both the toolkit and the tools teams now, and they're very separate teams, and they run very independently. Clara basically leads the toolkit, without any micromanagement, right? Hopefully she'll agree.
No pressure.
And so typically we don't really tend to benefit from our own things, right? But this is one of those cases where we typically build things and hope that people like it. But this was one of those things where we're using Compose and going this is amazing. This tech is amazing. And I feel like the result, the UI that we're producing in the new Kotlin Studio, this is primarily the AI agent. I'm biased, but I think it looks better than every other agent out there. And it's because Compose, it's all those, we have UX people who care, and you can put subtle things in. You can just get things don't just switch like I see in certain other products, right? They animate out. And this is
I remember you coming and showing us the animation when Studio Bot was first thing. Look.
Yeah, I'm still excited about it because just, those things, they make a lot of difference, and so kind of to see that collaboration across the team and benefiting from it, not just going well, people like it, that's a good feeling, right? But to personally feel it, that's a good thing.
But to make a good point, because that's something we didn't touch upon, but the priority was obviously always Android. But early days, we figured it could be cross-platform, even just desktop, someday. And we did leave a lot of facilities in the code base to enable that. Obviously, it wasn't perfect because, until you do it for real, you're not going to get it completely right. But I think it really helped, having Compose multi-platform become a thing later on.
Yep.
Because it was somewhat...
To be fair, they started pre-1.0.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been enabling them.
But since very early in the lifetime of Compose...
Them being JetBrains.
Yeah.
That was something that was in the back of everybody's mind, and I think that was super helpful.
I think we could keep going all day, but we probably should.
We can do it to another day.
Yes. So, yay, happy birthday. I hope we don't have to sing.
Happy birthday, Compose.
So what's the next UI toolkit?
Hey, I'm still working on Compose.
I think it's 10 years from 1.0 because the toolkit, when we did it, it was it was essentially a 1.0.
Yeah, it was about 10 years later.
Studio had its 10-year anniversary 2 years ago now. And we're still working on it. So, we've got a ways to go with Compose as well.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Now I can't wait for people to listen to the episode and tell us about everything we said that was wrong. The timing, the dates.
Oh, absolutely.
I was trying to pull up, the docs from Boston.
I wonder what your eyes.
No, because I have a doc. I wrote that.
I have a slide deck. I did all the research, and I have a slide deck I give to the team internally with all the exact points in time. That's why I know Jetpack was during alpha, and I should have pulled that before. I'm sorry.